Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 1, Chapter 4, Admirals All. Concerning brave captains, our age hath made known. Quote by Rudyard Kipling. Mr. McKenna and I changed guard with strict punctilio. In the morning he came over to the Home Office and I introduced him to the officials there. In the afternoon I went over to the Admiralty. He presented his board and principal officers and departmental heads to me, and then took his leave. I knew he felt greatly his change of office, but no one would have divined it from his manner. As soon as he had gone, I convened a formal meeting of the board, at which the secretary read the letters patent constituting me its head, and I thereupon, in the words of the Order in Council, became responsible to Crown and Parliament for all the business of the Admiralty. I was to endeavour to discharge this responsibility for the 4 most memorable years of my life. The state of Admiralty business was as follows. The estimates and plans for the financial year 1912-13 were far advanced. The programme had been settled and the designs of the vessels only awaited final approval. We were to lay down 3 battleships, 1 battle cruiser, 2 light cruisers, Dartmouths, 1 smaller light cruiser, a Blonde, the usual flotilla of 20 destroyers, and a number of submarines and ancillary craft. The estimates embodying this policy had to be passed by the Cabinet at the latest by the end of February, and presented to the House of Commons in the utmost detail in March. But a great uncertainty hung over all these plans. A continued succession of rumours and reports from many sources, and of hints and allusions in the German press, foreshadowed a further German naval increase. This, following upon all that had gone before and coming at a moment when relations were so tense, must certainly aggravate the situation. It would inevitably compel us to take important additional countermeasures. What these countermeasures would have to be could not be decided till the text of the new German Navy law was known to us. It was clear, however, from the information received that it was not only to be an increase in new construction, but in the number of squadrons or vessels maintained in a state of instant and constant readiness. In addition to these complications were a number of naval questions of prime importance which I conceived required new treatment. First, the war plans of the fleet, which up to that moment had been based upon the principle of close blockade. Second, the organization of the fleets with a view to increasing their instantly ready strength. Third, measures to guard against all aspects of surprise in the event of a sudden attack. Fourth, the formation of a naval war staff. Fifth, the concerting of the war plans of the Navy and the Army by close cooperation of the 2 departments. Sixth, further developments in design to increase the gunpower of our new ships in all classes. Seventh, changes in the high commands of the fleet and in the composition of the Board of Admiralty. To all these matters I addressed myself in constant secret consultations with the principal persons concerned in each. For the present, however, I arrived at no important decisions, but laboured continually to check and correct the opinions with which I had arrived at the Admiralty by the expert information which, on every subject, was now at my disposal. With the agreement of the Sea Lords, I gave certain directions on minor points immediately. The flotilla of destroyers sanctioned in the 1911-12 estimates would not have been let out to contract till the very end of the financial year. We now accelerated these 20 boats, the Ls, by 4 months, and thus, though we could not possibly foresee it, they were almost all fully commissioned just in time for the great review and mobilization of the fleet which preceded the outbreak of war. I gave, moreover, certain personal directions to enable me to sleep quietly in my bed. The naval magazines were to be effectively guarded under the direct charge of the Admiralty. The continuous attendance of naval officers, additional to that of the resident clerks, was provided at the Admiralty, so that any hour of the day or night, weekdays, Sundays, or holidays, there would never be a moment lost in giving the alarm. And one of the Sea Lords was always to be on duty in or near the Admiralty building to receive it. Upon the wall behind my chair I had an open case fitted, within whose folding doors spread a large chart of the North Sea. On this chart every day a staff officer marked with flags the position of the German fleet. Never once was this ceremony omitted until the war broke out, and the great maps, covering the whole of one side of the war room, began to function. I made a rule to look at my chart once every day when I first entered my room. I did this less to keep myself informed, for there were many other channels of information, than in order to inculcate in myself and those working with me a sense of ever-present danger. In this spirit we all worked. I must now introduce the reader to the two great admirals of the fleet, Lord Fisher and Sir Arthur Wilson, whose outstanding qualities and life's work, afloat and at the Admiralty, added to and reacted upon by the energies and patriotism of Lord Charles Beresford, had largely made the Royal Navy what it was at this time. The names of both Fisher and Wilson must often recur in these pages, for they played decisive parts in the tale I have to tell. I first met Lord Fisher at Biarritz in 1907. We stayed for a fortnight as the guests of a common friend. He was then First Sea Lord and in the height of his reign. We talked all day long and far into the nights. He told me wonderful stories of the Navy and of his plans, all about dreadnoughts, all about submarines, all about the new education scheme for every branch of the Navy, all about big guns, and splendid admirals and foolish miserable ones, and Nelson and the Bible, and finally the island of Borkum. I remembered it all. I reflected on it often. I even remembered the island of Borkum when my teacher had ceased to think so much of it. At any rate, when I returned to my duties at the Colonial Office, I could have passed an examination on the policy of the then Board of Admiralty. For at least 10 years, all the most important steps taken to enlarge, improve, or modernize the Navy had been due to Fisher. The water-tube boiler, the all-big gunship, the introduction of the submarine, Fisher's toys, as Lord Charles Beresford called them, the common education scheme, the system of nucleus crews for ships in reserve, and latterly, to meet the German rivalry, the concentration of the fleets in home waters, the scrapping of great quantities of ships of little fighting power, the great naval programs of 1908 and 1909, the advance from the 12-inch to the 13.5-inch gun, all in the main were his. In carrying through these far-reaching changes, he had created violent oppositions to himself in the Navy, and his own methods, in which he gloried, were of a kind to excite bitter animosities, which he returned and was eager to repay. He made it known, indeed he proclaimed, that officers of whatever rank who opposed his policies would have their professional careers ruined. As for traitors, that is, those who struck at him openly or secretly, their wives should be widows, their children fatherless, their homes a dunghill. This he repeated again and again. Ruthless, relentless, and remorseless were words always on his lips, and many grisly examples of admirals and captains eating out their hearts on the beach showed that he meant what he said. He did not hesitate to express his policy in the most unfavorable terms, as if to challenge and defy his enemies and critics. Favoritism, he wrote in the log of Dartmouth College, is the secret of efficiency. What he meant by favoritism was selection without regard to seniority by a discerning genius in the interests of the public. But the word favoritism stuck. Officers were said to be in the fish pond, unlucky for them if they were not. He poured contempt upon the opinions and arguments of those who did not agree with his schemes, and abused them at all times both by word and letter. In the Royal Navy, however, there were a considerable number of officers of social influence and independent means, many of whom became hostile to Fisher. They had access to Parliament and to the press. In sympathy with them, though not with all their methods, was a much larger body of good and proved sea officers. At the head of the whole opposition stood Lord Charles Beresford, at that time Commander-in-Chief of the Channel or Principal Fleet. A deplorable schism was introduced into the Royal Navy, which spread to every squadron and to every ship. There were Fisher's men and Beresford's men. Whatever the First Sea Lord proposed, the Commander-in-Chief opposed, and through the whole of the service, captains and lieutenants were encouraged to take one side or the other. The argument was conducted with technicalities and with personalities. Neither side was strong enough to crush the other. The Admiralty had its backers in the fleet, and the fleet had its friends in the Admiralty. Both sides, therefore, had good information as to what was passing in the other camp. The lamentable situation thus created might easily have ruined the discipline of the Navy, but for the fact that a third large body of officers resolutely refused, at whatever cost to themselves, to participate in the struggle. Silently and steadfastly they went about their work till the storms of partisanship were past. To these officers a debt is due. There is no doubt whatever that Fisher was right in 9/10 of what he fought for. His great reforms sustained the power of the Royal Navy at the most critical period in its history. He gave the Navy the kind of shock which the British Army received at the time of the South African War. After a long period of serene and unchallenged complacency, the mutter of distant thunder could be heard. It was Fisher who hoisted the storm signal and beat all hands to quarters. He forced every department of the naval service to review its position and question its own existence. He shook them and beat them and cajoled them out of slumber into intense activity. But the Navy was not a pleasant place while this was going on. The Band of Brothers tradition, which Nelson had handed down, was for the time, but only for the time, discarded. And behind the open hostility of chieftains flourished the venomous intrigues of their followers. I have asked myself whether all this could not have been avoided, whether we could not have had the Fisher reforms without the Fisher methods. My conviction is that Fisher was maddened by the difficulties and obstructions which he encountered, and became violent in the process of fighting so hard at every step. In the government of a great fighting service there must always be the combination of the political and professional authorities. A strong First Sea Lord, to carry out a vigorous policy, needs the assistance of a minister, who alone can support him and defend him. The authority of both is more than doubled by their union. Each can render the other services of supreme importance when they are both effective factors. Working in harmony, they multiply each other. By the resultant concentration of combined power, no room or chance is given to faction. For good or for ill, what they decide together in the interests of the service must be loyally accepted. Unhappily, the latter years of Fisher's efforts were years in which the Admiralty was ruled by two ministers, both of whom were desperately and even mortally ill. Although most able and most upright public men, both Lord Calder and Lord Tweedmouth, First Lords from 1904 to 1908, were afflicted with extreme ill health. Moreover, neither was in the House of Commons, and able himself, by exposition in the responsible chamber, to proclaim in unquestioned accents the policy which the Admiralty would follow and which the House of Commons should ratify. When in 1908 Mr. McKenna became First Lord, there was a change. Gifted with remarkable clearness of mind and resolute courage, enjoying in the prime of life the fullest vigor of his faculties, and having acquired a strong political position in the House of Commons, he was able to supply an immediate steadying influence. But it was too late for Fisher. The Furies were upon his track. The opposition and hatreds had already grown too strong. The schism in the Navy continued, fierce and open. The incident which is most commonly associated with the end of this part of his career is that of the Bacon letters. Captain Bacon was one of the ablest officers in the Navy and a strong Fisherite. In 1906 he had been serving in the Mediterranean under Lord Charles Beresford. Fisher had asked him to write to him from time to time and keep him informed of all that passed. This he did in letters in themselves of much force and value, but open to the reproach and containing criticisms of his immediate commander. This in itself might have escaped unnoticed, but the First Sea Lord used to print in beautiful and carefully considered type letters, notes, and memoranda on technical subjects for the instruction and encouragement of the faithful. Delighted at the cogency of his arguments in the Bacon letters, he had them printed in 1909 and circulated fairly widely throughout the Admiralty. A copy fell at length into hostile hands and was swiftly conveyed to a London evening newspaper. The First Sea Lord was accused of encouraging subordinates in disloyalty to their immediate commanders. The episode was fatal, and at the beginning of 1910 Sir John Fisher quitted the Admiralty and passed, as everyone believed, finally into retirement, and the House of Lords, crowned with achievements, loaded with honours, but pursued by much obloquy amid the triumph of his foes. As soon as I knew for certain that I was to go to the Admiralty, I sent for Fisher. He was abroad in sunshine. We had not seen each other since the dispute about the naval estimates of 1909. He conceived himself bound in loyalty to Mr. McKenna, but as soon as he learned that I had had nothing to do with the decision which had led to our changing offices, he hastened home. We passed 3 days together in the comfort of Reigate Priory. Although my education had been mainly military, I had followed closely every detail of the naval controversies of the previous 5 years in the Cabinet, in Parliament, and latterly in the Committee of Imperial Defence, and I had certain main ideas of what I was going to do and what, indeed, I was sent to the Admiralty to do. I intended to prepare for an attack by Germany as if it might come next day. I intended to raise the fleet to the highest possible strength and secure that all that strength was immediately ready. I was pledged to create a war staff. I was resolved to have all arrangements made at once in the closest concert with the military to provide for the transportation of a British army to France should war come. I had strong support from the War Office and the Foreign Office. I had the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer at my back. Moreover, everyone who knew the crisis through which we had passed had been profoundly alarmed. In these circumstances, it only remained to study the methods and to choose the men. I found Fisher a veritable volcano of knowledge and of inspiration, and as soon as he learned what my main purpose was, he passed into a state of vehement eruption. It must indeed have been an agony to him to wait and idly watch from the calm lake of Lucerne through the anxious weeks of the long-drawn Agadir crisis, with his life's work, his beloved navy, liable at any moment to be put to the supreme test. Once he began, he could hardly stop. I plied him with questions, and he poured out ideas. It was always a joy to me to talk to him on these great matters, but most of all was he stimulating in all that related to the design of ships. He also talked brilliantly about admirals, but here one had to make a heavy discount on account of the feuds. My intention was to hold the balance even, and while adopting in the main the Fisher policy, to insist upon an absolute cessation of the vendetta. Knowing pretty well all that has been written in the preceding pages, I began our conversations with no thought of Fisher's recall. But by the Sunday night the power of the man was deeply borne in upon me, and I had almost made up my mind to do what I did 3 years later, and place him again at the head of the naval service. It was not the outcry that I feared, that I felt strong enough at this time to face. But it was the revival and continuance of the feuds, and it was clear from his temper that this would be inevitable. Then, too, I was apprehensive of his age. I could not feel complete confidence in the poise of the mind at 71. All the way up to London the next morning I was on the brink of saying, "Come and help me," and had he by a word seemed to wish to return, I would surely have spoken. But he maintained a proper dignity, and in an hour we were in London. Other reflections supervened. Adverse counsels were not lacking, and in a few days I had definitely made up my mind to look elsewhere for a first sea lord. I wonder whether I was right or wrong. For a man who for so many years filled great official positions and was charged with so much secret and deadly business, Lord Fisher appeared amazingly voluminous and reckless in correspondence. When for the purposes of this work and for the satisfaction of his biographers I collected all the letters I had received from the Admiral in his own hand, they amounted, when copied, to upwards of 300 closely typewritten pages. In the main, they repeat again and again the principal naval conceptions and doctrines with which his life had been associated. Although it would be easy to show many inconsistencies and apparent contradictions, the general message is unchanging. The letters are also presented in an entertaining guise, interspersed with fallacious and sometimes recondite quotations, with flashing phrases and images, with mordant jokes and corrosive personalities. All were dashed off red-hot as they left his mind, his strong pen galloping along the wake of the imperious thought. He would often audaciously fling out on paper thoughts which other people would hardly admit to their own minds. It is small wonder that his turbulent passage left so many foes foaming in his wake. The wonder is that he did not shipwreck himself a score of times. The buoyancy of his genius alone supported the burden. Indeed, in the process of years, the profuse and imprudent violence of his letters became, in a sense, its own protection. People came to believe that this was the breezy style appropriate to our guardians of the deep, and the old admiral swept forward on his stormy course. To me, in this period of preparation, the arrival of his letters was always a source of lively interest and pleasure. I was regaled with 8 or 10 closely written double pages, fastened together with a little pearl pin or scrap of silken ribbon, and containing every kind of news and counsel, varying from blistering reproach to the highest forms of inspiration and encouragement. From the very beginning, his letters were couched in an affectionate and paternal style. "My beloved Winston," they began, ending usually with a variation of "yours to a cinder," "yours till hell freezes," or "till charcoal sprouts," followed by a P.S. and 2 or 3 more pages of pregnant and brilliant matter. I have found it impossible to reread these letters without sentiments of strong regard for him, his fiery soul, his volcanic energy, his deep creative mind, his fierce outspoken hatreds, his love of England. Alas, there was a day when hell froze and charcoal sprouted and friendship was reduced to cinders, when my beloved Winston had given place to First Lord, "I can no longer be your colleague." I am glad to be able to chronicle that this was not the end of our long and intimate relationship. Sir Arthur Wilson, the First Sea Lord, received me with his customary dignified simplicity. He could not, of course, be wholly unaware of the main causes which had brought me to the Admiralty. In conversation with the other sea lords, when the well-kept secret of my appointment first reached the Admiralty, he said, "We are to have new masters. If they wish us to serve them, we will do so, and if not, they will find others to carry on the work." I had only met him hitherto at the conferences of the Committee of Imperial Defence, and my opinions were divided between an admiration for all I heard of his character and a total disagreement with what I understood to be his strategic views. He considered the creation of a war staff quite unnecessary. I had come to set one up. He did not approve of the War Office plans for sending an army to France in the event of war. I considered it my duty to perfect these arrangements to the smallest detail. He was, as I believed, still an advocate of a close blockade of the German ports, which, to my lay or military mind, the torpedo seemed already to have rendered impossible. Footnote: the close blockade of the German ports was prescribed in the War Orders of 1909, during Lord Fisher's term of office. Sir Arthur Wilson did not reveal any modification which he had made in consequence of new conditions to anyone. End of footnote. These were large and vital differences. He, on his side, probably thought we had got into an unnecessary panic over the Agadir crisis, and that we did not properly understand the strength and mobility of the British fleet, nor the true character of British strategic power. He was due to retire for age from the service in 3 or 4 months, unless his tenure had been extended, while I, for my part, came to the Admiralty with a very clear intention to have an entirely new board of my own choosing. In these circumstances, our association was bound to be bleak. This is, however, the moment for me to give an impression of this striking naval personality. He was, without any exception, the most selfless man I have ever met or even read of. He wanted nothing, and he feared nothing, absolutely nothing. Whether he was commanding the British fleet or repairing an old motor car, he was equally keen, equally interested, equally content. To step from a great office into absolute retirement, to return from retirement to the pinnacle of naval power, were transitions which produced no change in the beat of that constant heart. Everything was duty. It was not merely that nothing else mattered. There was nothing else. One did one's duty as well as one possibly could, be it great or small, and naturally one deserved no reward. This had been the spirit in which he had lived his long life afloat, and which, by his example, he had spread far and wide through the ranks of the navy. It made him seem very unsympathetic on many occasions, both to officers and men. Orders were orders, whether they terminated an officer's professional career or led him on to fame, whether they involved the most pleasant or the most disagreeable work. And he would snap his teeth and smile his wintry smile to all complaints and to sentiment and emotions in every form. Never once did I see his composure disturbed. He never opened up, never unbent. Never once, until a very dark day for me, did I learn that my work had met with favor in his eyes. All the same, for all his unsympathetic methods, Tug, as he was generally called, because he was always working, that is, pulling, hauling, and tugging, or alternatively old Art, was greatly loved in the fleet. Men would do hard and unpleasant work even when they doubted its necessity, because he had ordered it and it was his way. He had served as a midshipman in the Crimean War. Everyone knew the story of his V.C., when the square broke at Tamai in the Sudan, and when he was seen, with the ammunition of his Gatling exhausted, knocking the dervish spearmen over one after another with his fists, using the broken hilt of his sword as a sort of knuckle-duster. Stories were told of his apparent insensibility to weather and climate. He would wear a thin monkey jacket in midwinter in the North Sea with apparent comfort, while everyone else was shivering in great coats. He would stand bareheaded under the tropical sun without ill effects. He had a strong inventive turn of mind and considerable mechanical knowledge. The system of countermining, in use for 40 years in the Navy, and the masthead semaphore, which continued till displaced by wireless telegraphy, were both products of his ingenuity. He was an experienced and masterly commander of a fleet at sea. In addition to this, he expressed himself with great clearness and thoroughness on paper, many of his documents being extended arguments of exact detail and widely comprehensive scope. He impressed me from the first as a man of the highest quality and stature, but, as I thought, dwelling too much in the past of naval science, not sufficiently receptive of new ideas when conditions were changing so rapidly, and of course tenacious and unyielding in the last degree. After we had had several preliminary talks, and I found we were not likely to reach an agreement, I sent him a minute about the creation of a naval war staff, which raised an unmistakable issue. He met it by a powerfully reasoned and unqualified refusal. And I then determined to form a new board of Admiralty without delay. The Lords of the Admiralty hold quasi-ministerial appointments, and it was of course necessary to put my proposals before the Prime Minister and obtain his assent. Mr. Churchill to the Prime Minister. HMS Enchantress, Portsmouth, November 5, 1911. The enclosed memorandum from Sir Arthur Wilson is decisive in its opposition, not only to any particular scheme, but against the whole principle of a war staff for the Navy. Ottley's rejoinder, footnote, Sir Charles Ottley, at that time Secretary to the Committee of Imperial Defence, end of footnote, which I also sent you, shows that it would not be difficult to continue the argument. But I feel that this might easily degenerate into personal controversy, and would, in any case, be quite unavailing. I like Sir Arthur Wilson personally, and should be very sorry to run the risk of embittering relations which are now pleasant. I therefore propose to take no public action during his tenure. If Wilson retires in the ordinary course in March, I shall be left without a First Sea Lord in the middle of the passage of the estimates, and his successor will not be able to take any real responsibility for them. It is necessary, therefore, that the change should be made in January at the latest. I could, if I were imperative, propose to you a new board for submission to the King at once. The field of selection for the first place is narrow, and since I have, with a good deal of reluctance, abandoned the idea of bringing Fisher back, no striking appointment is possible. I may, however, just as well enjoy the advantage of reserving a final choice for another month. At present, therefore, I will only say that Prince Louis is certainly the best man to be second Sea Lord, that I find myself in cordial agreement with him on nearly every important question of naval policy, and that he will accept the appointment gladly. I should thus hope to start in the new year with a united and progressive board, and with the goodwill of both the factions whose animosities have done so much harm. Meanwhile, I am elaborating the scheme of a war staff. Mr. Churchill to the Prime Minister, November 16, 1911. I have now to put before you my proposals for a new Board of Admiralty, and the changes consequent thereupon. Having now seen all the principal officers who might be considered candidates for such a post, I pronounce decidedly in favour of Sir Francis Bridgeman as First Sea Lord. He is a fine sailor, with the full confidence of the service afloat, and with the aptitude for working with and through a staff, well developed. If, as would no doubt be the case, he should bring Captain de Bartolome as his naval assistant, I am satisfied that the work of this office would proceed smoothly and with dispatch. I have discussed the principal questions of strategy, administration, and finance with him, and believe that we are in general agreement on fundamental principles. If you approve, I will write to Sir Francis and enter more fully into these matters in connection with an assumption by him of these new duties. This appointment harmonizes, personally and administratively, with that of the new second Sea Lord, Prince Louis of Battenberg, of whom I have already written to you, and of whose assistance I have the highest expectations. Rear Admiral Briggs, the Controller and third Sea Lord, has, after a year, just begun to acquire a complete knowledge of his very extensive department, and I do not think it is necessary to transfer him at the present time. He will be the only naval member of the old board to remain. Rear Admiral Madden is, in any case, leaving on January 5, and I am advised from all quarters, including both the proposed first and second Sea Lords, that the best man to fill his place is Captain Pakenham. This officer, who is very highly thought of for his intellectual attainments, has also the rare distinction of having served throughout the Russo-Japanese War, including the Battle of the Tsushima. The home fleet, which becomes vacant, has not, unhappily, any candidate of clear and preeminent qualifications. Admiral Jellicoe is not yet sufficiently in command of the confidence of the sea service to justify what would necessarily be a very startling promotion. I shall, however, be taking the perfectly straightforward and unexceptionable course in placing Vice Admiral Sir George Callaghan, the present second in command, who has been in almost daily control of the largest manoeuvres of the home fleet, and who has previously been second in command in the Mediterranean, in the place of Sir F. Bridgeman. Sir John Jellicoe will be his second in command, and we shall thus be able to see what fitness he will develop for the succession. It appears to me not merely important but necessary that these changes should operate without delay. The draft estimates have all arrived for discussion, and a month of the most severe work, governing the whole future policy of the next 2 years, awaits the Board of Admiralty. This task can only be satisfactorily discharged if it is undertaken by men who come together with consenting minds, and who will find themselves responsible to the Cabinet and to Parliament for the immediate consequences of their decisions. I would therefore ask you to authorize me to approach all parties concerned without delay, and unless some unexpected hitch occurs, I shall hope to submit the list to the King not later than Wednesday next. The new board would thus be fully constituted before the end of the present month. Afloat, the decisive appointment was that of Sir John Jellicoe to be second in command of the Home Fleet. He thus, in effect, passed over the heads of 4 or 5 of the most important senior admirals on the active list, and became virtually designated for the supreme command in the near future. The announcement of these changes on November 28 created a considerable sensation in the House of Commons when, late at night, they became known. All the Sea Lords, except one, had been replaced by new men. I was immediately interrogated. Had they resigned or been told to go, and so on? I gave briefly such explanations as were necessary. At this time I was very strong, because most of those who knew the inner history of the Agadir crisis were troubled about the fleet, and it was well known that I had been sent to the Admiralty to make a new and a vehement effort. Sir Arthur Wilson and I parted on friendly, civil, but at the same time cool terms. He showed not the least resentment at the short curtailment of his tenure. He was as good-tempered and as distant as ever. Only once did he show the slightest sign of vehemence. That was when I told him that the Prime Minister was willing to submit his name to the King for a peerage. He disengaged himself from this with much vigor. What would he do with such a thing? It would be ridiculous. However, His Majesty resolved to confer upon him the Order of Merit, and this he was finally persuaded to accept. On his last night in office he gave a dinner to the new Sea Lords in the true Band of Brothers style, and then retired to Norfolk. I could not help thinking uncomfortably of the famous Tenniel cartoon, Dropping the Pilot, when the inexperienced and impulsive German emperor is depicted carelessly watching the venerable figure of Bismarck descending the ladder. Nevertheless, I had acted on high public grounds and on those alone, and I fortified myself with them. As will be seen in its proper place, Sir Arthur Wilson came back to the Admiralty 3 years later, and worked with Lord Fisher and me during the 6 months of our association in the war. When Lord Fisher resigned in May 1915, I invited Sir Arthur to take up the duties of First Sea Lord, and he consented to do so. On learning, however, a few days later that I was to leave the Admiralty, he wrote to Mr. Asquith, refusing to undertake the task under any other First Lord but me. Here is the letter. May 19, 1915. Dear Mr. Asquith, in view of the reports in the papers this morning as to the probable reconstruction of the government, I think I ought to tell you that although I agreed to undertake the office of First Sea Lord under Mr. Churchill, because it appeared to be the best means of maintaining continuity of policy under the unfortunate circumstances that have arisen, I am not prepared to undertake the duties under any new First Lord, as the strain under such circumstances would be far beyond my strength. Believe me, yours truly, A.K. Wilson. At that time I hardly seemed to have a friend in the official or parliamentary world. All the press were throwing the blame of the Dardanelles entanglement and of any other things upon me, and I was everywhere represented as a rash, presumptuous person with whom no Board of Admiralty could work. Sir Arthur had never previously given me any sign of approval, though, of course, we had laboured together day after day. I was therefore astounded to learn what he had done. It came as an absolute surprise to me, and I do not mind saying that I felt as proud as a young officer mentioned for the first time in dispatches. I thought it my duty, however, to try to overcome his objections, as I knew the Prime Minister wanted him to take the post. But it was all in vain. He stuck to his opinion that he could do it with me and with nobody else. I felt deeply touched. There was nothing to be touched about, he observed. You know all the moves on the board. I should only have to put the brake on from time to time. I could not possibly manage with anyone else. And that was the end of it. He continued working in a subordinate position at the Admiralty till the end of the war. I hardly ever saw him afterwards, but I have preserved a memory which is very precious to me. The new Fourth Sea Lord was an officer of singular firmness and character. He possessed a unique experience of naval war. Since Nelson himself, no British naval officer had been so long at sea, in time of war, on a ship of war, without setting foot on land. Captain Pakenham had been 14 months afloat in the battleship Asahi during the war between Russia and Japan. Although this vessel was frequently in harbour, he would not leave it for fear she might sail without him. And there alone, the sole European in a great ship's company of valiant, reticent, inscrutable Japanese, he had gone through the long vigil outside Port Arthur, with its repeated episodes of minefields and bombardments, till the final battle of the Sea of Japan. Always faultlessly attired, he matched the Japanese with punctilio and reserve, the equal of their own, and finally captivated their martial spirit and won their unstinted and outspoken admiration. Admiral Togo has related how the English officer, as the Asahi was going into action at the last great battle, when the heavy shells had already begun to strike the ship, remained impassive, alone on the open after-bridge, making his notes and taking his observations of the developing action for the reports which he was to send to his government, and acclaiming him with Japanese chivalry, recommended him to the Emperor for the highest honor this warlike and knightly people could bestow. The unique sea-going record in time of war on a ship of war which Captain Pakenham brought to the Admiralty has been maintained to him to this day, and to 14 months of sea-going service with the Japanese fleet he may now add 52 months constant service with the battle-cruisers, during which time it is credible reported that he never on any occasion at sea lay down to rest otherwise than fully dressed, collared and booted, ready at any moment of the night or day. A few weeks after my arrival at the Admiralty, I was told that among several officers of flag rank who wished to see me was Rear Admiral Beatty. I had never met him before, but I had the following impressions about him. First, that he was the youngest flag officer in the fleet. Second, that he had commanded the white gunboat which had come up the Nile as close as possible to support the 21st Lancers when we made the charge at Omdurman. Third, that he had seen a lot of fighting on land with the army, and that consequently he had military as well as naval experience. Fourth, that he came of a hard-riding stock. His father had been in my own regiment, the 4th Hussars, and I have often heard him talked of when I first joined. The Admiral, I knew, was a very fine horseman, with what is called an eye for country. Fifth, that there was much talk in naval circles of his having been pushed on too fast. Such were the impressions aroused in my mind by the name of this officer, and I record them with minuteness because the decisions which I had the honour of taking in regard to him were most serviceable to the Royal Navy and to the British arms. I was, however, advised about him at the Admiralty in a decisively adverse sense. He had got on too fast. He had many interests ashore. His heart, it was said, was not wholly in the service. He had been offered an appointment in the Atlantic Fleet suited to his rank as Rear Admiral. He had declined this appointment, a very serious step for a naval officer to take when appointments were few in proportion to candidates, and he should in consequence not be offered any further employment. It would be contrary to precedent to make a further offer. He had already been unemployed for 18 months, and he would probably be retired in the ordinary course at the expiration of the full 3 years' unemployment. But my first meeting with the Admiral induced me immediately to disregard this unfortunate advice. He became at once my naval secretary, or private secretary, as the appointment was then styled. Working thus side by side in rooms which communicated, we perpetually discussed during the next 15 months the problem of a naval war with Germany. It became increasingly clear to me that he viewed questions of naval strategy and tactics in a different light from the average naval officer. He approached them, as it seemed to me, much more as a soldier would. His war experiences on land had illuminated the facts he had acquired in his naval training. He was no mere instrumentalist. He did not think of material as an end in itself, but only as a means. He thought of war problems in their unity by land, sea, and air. His mind had been rendered quick and supple by the situations of polo and the hunting field, and enriched by varied experiences against the enemy on Nile gunboats and ashore. It was with equal pleasure and profit that I discussed with him our naval problem, now from this angle, now from that, and I was increasingly struck with the shrewd and profound sagacity of his comments expressed in language singularly free from technical jargon. I had no doubts whatever, when the command of the battle-cruiser squadron fell vacant in the spring of 1913, in appointing him over the heads of all to this incomparable command, the nucleus, as it proved to be, of the famous battle-cruiser fleet, the strategic cavalry of the Royal Navy, that supreme combination of speed and power to which the thoughts of the Admiralty were continuously directed. And when 2 years later, on February 3, 1915, I visited him on board the Lion, with the scars of victorious battle fresh upon her from the action of the Dogger Bank, I heard from his captains and his admirals the expression of their respectful but intense enthusiasm for their leader. Well do I remember how, as I was leaving the ship, the usually imperturbable Admiral Pakenham caught me by the sleeve. "First Lord, I wish to speak to you in private," and the tense conviction in his voice as he said, "Nelson has come again." Those words often recurred to my mind. So much of my work in endeavoring to prepare the fleet for war was dependent upon the guidance and help I received from Prince Louis of Battenberg, who, taking it as a whole, was my principal counselor. As Second Sea Lord from January 1912 to March 1913, when Sir Francis Bridgeman's health temporarily failed, and as First Sea Lord thenceforward to the end of October 1914, that it is necessary to give some description of this remarkable prince and British sailor. All the more is this necessary since the accident of his parentage struck him down in the opening months of the Great War and terminated his long professional career. Prince Louis was a child of the Royal Navy. From his earliest years he had been bred to the sea. The deck of a British warship was his home. All his interest was centered in the British fleet. So far from his exalted rank having helped him, it had hindered his career. Up to a certain point, no doubt, it had been of assistance, but after that it had been a positive drawback. In consequence, he had spent an exceptionally large proportion of his 40 years' service afloat, usually in the less agreeable commands. One had heard at Malta how he used to bring his cruiser squadron into that small, crowded harbour at speed, and then, in the nick of time, with scarcely 100 yards to spare, by dropping his anchors, checking on his cables, and going full speed astern, bring it safely into station. He had a far wider knowledge of war by land and sea, and of the continent of Europe, than most of the other admirals I have known. His brother, as King of Bulgaria, had shown military aptitudes of a very high order at the Battle of Slivnica, and he himself was deeply versed in every detail, practical and theoretic, of the British naval service. It was not without good reason that he had been appointed under Lord Fisher to be head of the British Naval Intelligence Department, that vital ganglion of our organization. He was a thoroughly trained and accomplished staff officer, with a gift of clear and lucid statement, and all that thoroughness and patient industry which we have never underestimated in the German race. It was recounted of him that on one occasion, when he visited Kiel with King Edward, a German admiral in high command had reproached him with serving in the British fleet, whereat Prince Louis, stiffening, had replied, "Sir, when I joined the Royal Navy in the year 1868, the German Empire did not exist." The part which he played in the events with which I am dealing will be recorded as the story unfolds. Our first labor was the creation of the war staff. All the details of this were worked out by Prince Louis and approved by the First Sea Lord. I also resorted to Sir Douglas Haig, at that time in command at Aldershot. The general furnished me with a masterly paper setting forth the military doctrine of staff organization and constituting, in many respects, a formidable commentary on existing naval methods. Armed with these various opinions, I presented my conclusions to the public in January 1912, in a document of which the first 2 paragraphs may be repeated here. They were, as will be seen, designed so far as possible to disarm the prejudices of the naval service. First, in establishing a war staff for the Navy, it is necessary to observe the broad differences of character and circumstances which distinguish naval from military problems. War on land varies in every country according to numberless local conditions, and each new theatre, like each separate battlefield, requires a special study. A whole series of intricate arrangements must be thought out and got ready for each particular case, and these are expanded and refined continuously by every increase in the size of armies, and by every step towards the perfection of military science. The means by which superior forces can be brought to decisive points in good condition and at the right time are no whit less vital, and involve far more elaborate processes than the strategic choice of those points, or the actual conduct of the fighting. The sea, on the other hand, is all one, and, though ever-changing, always the same. Every ship is self-contained and self-propelled. The problems of transport and supply, the infinite peculiarities of topography, which are the increasing study of the general staffs of Europe, do not affect the naval service, except in an occasional and limited degree. The main part of the British fleet, in sufficient strength to seek a general battle, is always ready to proceed to sea without any mobilization of reserves as soon as steam is raised. Ships or fleets of ships are capable of free and continuous movement for many days and nights together, and travel at least as far in an hour as an army can march in a day. Every vessel is in instant communication with its fleet and with the Admiralty, and all can be directed from the ports where they are stationed on any sea points chosen for massing, by a short and simple order. Unit efficiency, that is to say, the individual fighting power of each vessel and each man, is in the sea service for considerable periods entirely independent of all external arrangements, and unit efficiency at sea, far more even than on land, is the prime and final factor, without which the combinations of strategy and tactics are only the preliminaries of defeat, but with which even faulty dispositions can be swiftly and decisively retrieved. For these and other similar reasons, a naval war staff does not require to be designed on the same scale or in the same form as the general staff of the army. Second, naval war is at once more simple and more intense than war on land. The executive action and control of fleet and squadron commanders is direct and personal in a far stronger degree than that of generals in the field, especially under modern conditions. The art of handling a great fleet on important occasions with deft and sure judgment is the supreme gift of the admiral, and practical seamanship must never be displaced from its position as the first qualification of every sailor. The formation of a war staff does not mean the setting up of new standards of professional merit or the opening of a road of advancement to a different class of officers. It is to be the means of preparing and training those officers who arrive, or are likely to arrive, by the excellence of their sea service at stations of high responsibility, for dealing with the more extended problems which await them there. It is to be the means of sifting, developing, and applying the results of actual experience in history and present practice, and of preserving them as a general stock of reasoned opinion available as an aid and as a guide for all who are called upon to determine, in peace or war, the naval policy of the country. It is to be a brain far more comprehensive than that of any single man, however gifted, and tireless and unceasing in its action, applied continuously to the scientific and speculative study of naval strategy and preparation. It is to be an instrument capable of formulating any decision which has been taken or may be taken by the executive in terms of precise and exhaustive detail. I never ceased to labor at the formation of a true general staff for the Navy. In May 1914, basing myself on the report of a committee which I had set up a year before, I drafted a fairly complete scheme for the further development of staff training. I quote a salient passage. It is necessary to draw a distinction between the measures required to secure a general diffusion of military knowledge among naval officers and the definite process by which staff officers are trained. The first may be called military education, and the second war staff training. They require to be treated separately and not mixed together, as in the report of the committee. Both must again be distinguished from all questions of administration, of material, and of non-military education and training. The application of fighting power can thus be separated from its development. We are not now concerned with the forging of the weapon, but only with its use. As early as possible in the service, the mind of the young officer must be turned to the broad principles of war by sea and land. His interest must be awakened. He must be put in touch with the right books, and must be made to feel the importance of the military aspect of his profession. But it makes a generation to form a general staff. No wave of the wand can create those habits of mind in seniors on which the efficiency and even the reality of a staff depends. Young officers can be trained, but thereafter they have to rise step by step in the passage of time to positions of authority in the service. The dead weight of professional opinion was adverse. They had got on well enough with it before. They did not want a special class of officer professing to be more brainy than the rest. Sea time should be the main qualification, and next to that technical aptitudes. Thus, when I went to the Admiralty, I found that there was no moment in the career and training of a naval officer when he was obliged to read a single book about naval war, or pass even the most rudimentary examination in naval history. The Royal Navy had made no important contributions to naval literature. The standard work on sea power was written by an American admiral, Admiral Mahan. The best accounts of British sea fighting and naval strategy were compiled by an English civilian, Sir Julian Corbett. The silent service was not mute because it was absorbed in thought and study, but because it was weighted down by its daily routine and by its ever-complicating and diversifying technique. We had competent administrators, brilliant experts of every description, unequaled navigators, good disciplinaries, fine sea officers, brave and devoted hearts. But at the outset of the conflict we had more captains of ships than captains of war. In this will be found the explanation of many untoward events. At least 15 years of consistent policy were required to give the Royal Navy that widely extended outlook upon war problems and of war situations without which seamanship, gunnery, instrumentalism of every kind, devotion of the highest order could not achieve their due reward. 15 years, and we were only to have 30 months.